Test, test, test.
This little dot out here on its own is Dinesh Karthik. He's currently the fastest scorer in the IPL. Jarrod, who was actually dropped earlier this year, is still sniffing at his heels, but he hasn't made anywhere near as many runs just because he hasn't played that much. Two other players have had pretty special overseas seasons. Liam Livingstone, who's been hinting at this for quite some time, and what looks like it's going to be a completely wasted season for what is coming to the end of Andre Russell's incredible career. But Tim David and Andre Russell and Liam Livingstone, those three make sense. Especially Dre Russ, because he quite often scores really quick. Livingstone has been hitting the ball like a hammer for ages now, and really since David turned up for Singapore, he's been on his way to the IPL or the Australian team. It was kind of a race to see which one he got to first.
This is the last knot. My dad told me to say this.
Whereas Karthik had a strike rate of 131 last year, 126 the year before. And this is the first IPL season he's ever been above 150. His career strike rate is 132. I mean, this year just looks kind of silly compared to everything else, doesn't it? But it looks worse when you think that this year he was on 5.5 crore. Almost 2 crore less than he was paid for every one of the last 4 years prior to this. That's a fine amount. It's an okay amount until you look at his strike rate and his record this year, and it does seem a little bit like a massive underpay. But if you look at his entire career so far in the IPL, you could see what an outlier this year is. It's just like nothing else he's ever done before. And you see these dots here, and you can see that all the dots are slightly different sizes. And that's because the size of the dot correlates directly with how much he's getting paid. So you can see that 2 of his highest paid years ever in the IPL were the worst when it came to results. 2015, he had a blip year for Bangalore, which is probably why it's taken him so long to make it back there. And in 2014, he had a fairly terrible year as well. But I assume his wage was inflated that year by a couple of teams needing a wicketkeeper. But in 2013, he'd been pretty good, averaging around 30. But all of those years just look silly compared to what he's doing at the moment. Especially when you look at what he did in 2020, which was quite a poor year, and 2021, which is pretty average for him. So based on all that, Karthik was not underpaid. He was correctly remunerated. It's just that he went berserk. So of course you have to then start asking why. This is not someone who just turned up. We know almost everything we need to know about Dinesh Karthik. And then this year, he does this. There is something interesting when you look at the way he's been used, that you could suggest that at times he's been maybe a little bit out of place. I mean, he is so good against fast bowling, yet quite often he gets pushed into the middle overs, which is not his best time. In fact, if you just have a look at here, you can really see his speciality. This is the last 5 years. The power play doesn't happen often for him, and that's fine, and it's not where he should be anyway. So we can discount that. In the middle, you can see he's just about as good as spin as he is against pace. But at the death, this is where his true worth comes in as a player. It's all about how well he hits quicks. He's a fantastic death batter, who I think too often over the last few years has just been promoted up the order. But when you look at his record, maybe I'm wrong about that. Because this seems to be something that he's learned over the last few years. He's been developing his game. This wasn't a pattern early in his career. He's developed into this death hitter. So there was probably a period where he was used incorrectly, but that was after 10 years of knowledge about him as a player. And the truth is that after 10 years of knowledge of him as a player, he changed. And the most important thing is he just got a lot better against pace. This is all the players with 450 runs against pace and spin in the last 5 years of the IPL. You can see he's a pretty good player against spin, don't get me wrong. But he's the second quickest scorer against the fast bowlers. This is not what you expect of someone his age. He's 36. You would expect him to struggle against the quicker bowlers as he's getting older. Instead, he's actually getting better at it. In fact, you wouldn't expect any player to be having a career best year at 36 unless they were a leg spinner or an incredibly late bloomer. And he's not either of those things. He's been on the circuit for years. Everyone knows everything they need to know about Dinesh Karthik. And yet, somehow, at this age, he's just put in this ridiculous year. And especially when you consider that he's had extra stress on his body because of all the wicket keeping he's had to do. You might expect him at this age to have a marginally improved year over the last couple of seasons if his body was feeling a little bit better. But this is a whole nother level of batting that he's never even hinted at before. I think it's also worth pointing out that when Karthik was approaching his prime, he actually really struggled. He got paid a lot of money and ended up bouncing around from team to team. In fact, from 2013 to 2016, he had 4 different teams. That's never a good spot to be in because your role changes with every team. Some coaches and captains back you. Sometimes when you're paid a lot, teams try and get more out of you. And when you're not paid a lot, you kind of get sidelined a little bit. Different pitches, different roles, different thoughts, different lineups. All these sorts of things would have affected him. And Karthik was all over the shop at that point. And considering what a quality player he has always been consistently, that does seem like a bit of a waste of his better year. This is the top 10 wicket keepers in the IPL history. He has the second most runs ever when holding the gloves. You can see that Dhoni and Karthik are the two biggest circles here. They actually have more runs than the following three keepers do combined. Dhoni is undisputed at this level for so many different reasons. But you can see here, his strike rate is one of the higher ones and he has the second best average. Plus, he can keep real good. KL Rahul doesn't keep as well. But he's miles out here because he's just one of the best batters in the IPL and has been for a long time. To have someone like him have a second skill, even if it's not brilliant at it, is so important. It actually means that the teams he's in should never have a weak batting lineup. Though, sadly, almost all the teams he's in do seem to have weak batting lineups. Up here is Rishabh Pant, incredible strike rate and very, very good average, and improving with the gloves. As far as just the glove work, you would say that Karthik is probably one of the better keepers here. But you can see just how far he is from the elite keepers when you look at average and strike rate over the entire career. He's better than Parthiv Patel and Wriddhiman Saha, but doesn't have the impact of someone like Sanju Samson with the bat. And if you start to think about all this from an Indian perspective, he's always been behind Dhoni. Fine, that's normal, we get that. Of recent times, Rishabh Pant has exploded beyond him and almost beyond everyone. And Saha has probably always shaded him with the gloves. It means that from an Indian perspective, he's kind of a permanent backup, always a squad member, never quite a star. And if you look at his IPL record, that's kind of what you see here as well. He's always there. He's good when he does an interview and he presents himself quite well. And both of his skills are probably well above replacement level players. But even when you combine them together, he's not a star in the way that some of these other wicketkeepers clearly are. But the ability to have such a ridiculously long career, probably for India as much as in the IPL, shows that he is a very high level player. And he is very respected. And you know that while he won't be a star in many teams, for most IPL teams, he's going to be an automatic starter. Unless they happen to have too many wicketkeepers around. And even then, he's probably a decent backup batter. And it's a player who's an automatic starter. You could see why they would make him captain. And that's what happened in 2021 in Kolkata. He was the captain until he didn't want to be the captain anymore. It should be pointed out that was also one of his more struggling years. You could see it tucked back here into his middling to mediocre section. I only really point that out because it tells you that even though he's never been a star, he's always been a fairly major player, if that makes sense. He kind of lives in this awkward middle ground where everyone knows who he is, but he's in and out for India, and he's a very good IPL player, but he's no one's idea of a star, until this year. But the fact he could captain also tells you a lot about him as a player. He has leadership skills. He has batting skills, he has wicket-keeping skills, and he has incredible experience. It would be hard to look at his overall record and not say he was a very, very good player. Just being able to play this many games for this long is extraordinary. But there is a problem that a lot of T20 players face, and I think Dinesh Karthik is a very good example of that. It's very rare for him to be in a position in a team where he can be used perfectly to maximize what he does well. To explain that, I'm actually going to use a far more random example. Daniel Sams. He's had a rough year at times, but his strength is he can hit lots of sixes and take lots of wickets, which sounds great, right? Who wouldn't want that? But those wickets often come with a huge economy, and he can't always be trusted as the fifth bowler because of that. And his runs are spectacular, but they're also incredibly inconsistent. In a team where he could bat at number 8 and share the fifth overs with a bowler who's slightly better than him, he'd be a very, very good player. But he can't bat at number 7 or be the main fifth option. And many quality players in T20 cricket are a bit like this. You see them in one situation and you think they're a star. You see them in another situation and you can't work out why it doesn't work. But the roles have changed. Where they bowl, where they bat, all these things change. And if you look back to Dinesh Karthik when he was at Kolkata in the last few years, we know that he was developing into this great death hitter. The problem was that Kolkata had Andre Russell and Pat Cummins, two players even better at hitting at the death than he was. In Dre Russ's case, you want to hold him back as far as you can to let him explode. And in Cummins' situation, there's no other choice. He can't play spin, so you have to hold him back until the spinners have stopped. So if you think about those three players, Karthik is the most proper type batter of those. So of course, if there's any problems, he's going to be placed up the order. And think about Kolkata's middle order at that time. They quite often had Sun on the Rhine there, plus they had Owen Morgan not making any runs last year. And in fact, if you look at all their top order, they don't actually have many players who average over 35, which meant that they were losing wickets a little bit more often than other teams might. So there was quite often a reason for Karthik to go in slightly earlier. So he's not in a great team environment for him to be able to maximise what he'd clearly worked on, which was smacking the hell out of the ball at the death. Even if Kolkata were a better batting unit and he could have been used more often where he wanted to be, chances are he still would have come in and would have had big hitters at the other end, some of which he may have even deferred to. If you look at his record over the last couple of years, you really want to hold him back as far as possible and then, let him snap like a rubber band in the last 5 overs. I'm not sure that was a situation he really had that often in Kolkata. Over half of his innings this year, he's been batting at number 7, which is where he has been at his best. But I just wanted to be slightly more scientific. For instance, last year at Kolkata, they kept collapsing a lot, and it meant that Karthik had to go up the order. RCB just haven't collapsed as much this year. But even when they have held Karthik back because he is kind of their only specialist death hitter. That is now his role in the team. I'm assuming that's actually why they recruited him. And if they'd been looking at the same numbers I had, to get a wicket keeper who could bat at the death and lock down that position for them, even if they thought he wasn't going to have a strike rate anywhere near as high as this, or an average anywhere near as high as this, they probably thought that they were getting a bargain. And they ended up getting a far bigger bargain than they probably ever assumed. But if you do look at this, you could still see quite a few Kolkata innings at the end as well. It's not like in one he was coming in between the 5th over and the 12th over, and in the other one he's only coming in after the 15th. He's just been better this year, and sometimes that's it. It's just this year he's been so much better than he's ever been, and so late in his career that it doesn't make any sense. You have this solid career batter in his twilight, leaving Kolkata with a substantial pay cut, turning up at a new team, and producing the kinds of figures that you would expect from his old Kolkata teammate, Jarrod. It's one of the most bizarre seasons I've ever seen in any T20 league, but it's certainly been fun. 99.94 is my new venture. It is Cricket's Conversation. We are looking for people to sign up to our beta launch at the moment. And if you want more information about what it is, just click on the 99.94 logo and head over to the site. At 99.94, we talk cricket.